This is welcome all to the Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis SIGS online seminar series. Looks like we've got folks joining us from all over the world this morning, and so we'll get right into it. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. G.J. Melendez-Torres, who is professor of social epidemiology, or clinical and social epidemiology at the University of Exeter's Medical School. And there he leads the Peninsula Technology Assessment Group and the School for Public Health Environments Research Group. GJ's work focuses on conceptual, methodological, and statistical issues in health technology assessment, and that often involves doing systematic reviews of complex interventions with many moving parts. But his work is certainly by no means limited to systematic reviews. From perusing his CV, in the past 3 years, he's been involved in projects ranging from meta-analysis of individual participant data, to realist reviews, to randomized trials, latent class analysis, network analysis, qualitative comparative analysis with fuzzy sets. And so the only term I can think of to characterize that would be he's a methodological polyglot. And I think that's sort of appropriate then, that his topic today is I think also related to methodological pluralism. He will be presenting for about 45 minutes, and should have plenty of time for discussion towards the end. As usual, during the presentation, you're welcome to leave questions or thoughts in the chat box, and we will monitor that and curate any questions to lead off the discussion at the end. So, GJ, I will pass it to you. Thank you very much again for joining us.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, James. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that thing where I say, can you see my screen? 1 second. Okay, yeah, okay. Great. Okay, so thanks so much, James, for that very kind introduction. So as you said, my name is G.J. Melendez-Torres, and today I'm going to talk to you about heterogeneity, which is one of my favorite topics in meta-analysis. This is not going to be a talk about tau squared or I squared. This is going to be a talk about how we deal with heterogeneity and how we can really use it as a basis to generate explanatory answers in systematic reviews. So first things first, I'm coming to you from the University of Exeter, which is in the southwest of England. As you can see, it's a very beautiful place to live. One of the things that I would really point out to you about Exeter, and if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, it's this, is that there is a right way to eat a scone, and that is by putting the jam first, or the double cream first and then the jam. That is the Devon way, and it is the only right way to eat a scone. And that, I think, is a #1 learning takeaway from this presentation. However, given that I am presenting to an audience of people who are notionally educationalists, I just wanted to start with some learning outcomes for today's presentation. The first learning outcome is that attendees will no longer experience alarm in the face of heterogeneity. The second learning outcome is that attendees will no longer experience helplessness in the face of heterogeneity. The third learning outcome is that attendees will come to appreciate heterogeneity for the gift that it is. And the final one is that attendees will no longer default to heterogeneity meant we could not combine studies when you are faced with a lot of heterogeneity in a meta-analysis. Now, even if I don't meet any of these learning outcomes, I do hope that I am able to accomplish the one thing that James Pustiowski told you all I was going to accomplish, which is that I was lively and informative in this next conversation. So, having dealt with some of the really important bits around learning outcomes, I'll now move on to the meat of this presentation. What I want to start from is a position that heterogeneity is an essential precondition in systematic reviews to explanation. And when I talk about explanation, what I mean is the need to move beyond this works to this intervention works better. This is a reason why some interventions work and others don't. This is a model to understand why interventions work. One of the reasons why I think a focus on explanation is so important is that explanation is central to social science in a way that I think meta-analysts don't always explicitly avow. Most systematic reviews stop at inferential predictive reasoning. Does this intervention work? Are we confident that it is a statistically significant level of effectiveness? When in fact, we could go much beyond that to use clinical and configurational reasoning to take study findings included in reviews beyond does it work to how does it work, why does it work, where does it work as well. Now, different methods to account for heterogeneity work in different ways. And to introduce this particular idea, I want to start from the idea that the distinction between statistical and clinical heterogeneity has never really been particularly satisfying to me. And the way that I prefer to think about this is actually in terms of left-hand side versus right-hand side heterogeneity. Left-hand side heterogeneity being heterogeneity in the effects, in their variance, in their variation, in the ways that they're measured. And right-hand side heterogeneity, which is to say heterogeneity in the types of interventions, the context of interventions, etc., where interventions are being deployed. This is important because it sets us up to understand how we can take advantage of both the left-hand side and the right-hand side heterogeneity as we develop explanatory accounts of that heterogeneity. Central to this idea as well is that explanatory accounts of heterogeneity can draw on deductive methods, abductive methods, or inductive methods. Now, the resulting explanations of that can also be confirmatory or exploratory. When I talk about confirmatory explanations of heterogeneity, what I mean are explanations of heterogeneity that give us a basis to undertake future decision-making. When I talk about exploratory accounts of heterogeneity, what I mean are accounts of heterogeneity that give us the basis to do further testing down the line, or that give us a starting point to do further theorizing. One of the ways that confirmatory and exploratory heterogeneity might be different in terms of those accounts of them could be in the context of application, which is to say, saying that something is generally effective, is it a good policy, is going to look different from saying, will it work in our local context? I'm still thinking about this, so thoughts are welcome during the question and answer portion of this presentation. I think when we understand explanatory accounts of heterogeneity, we also need to understand them in the context in which they are produced as well. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about deductive methods to account or to generate explanatory accounts drawing on heterogeneity. And the first one I want to talk about is network meta-analysis, which is an area I've been working on for several years now, and the ways that network meta-analysis can answer different kinds of questions in social science contexts. So the fundamental idea behind network meta-analysis is that we can estimate the comparative effectiveness of intervention strategies. And this really capitalizes on the heterogeneity that we would get from a general lumping approach to looking at the totality of interventions from all interventions in a class against a placebo, a treatment as usual, a business as usual condition. One of the reasons this is important to consider is that because there is an uneasy but an exciting translation from the clinical applications of network meta-analysis to its psychosocial applications. In a network meta-analysis undertaken in a clinical context, we're often focusing on grouping similar drugs or identical drugs, for example, constructing networks of different types of cancer treatments against each other compared to a best supportive care comparator. But in a psychosocial context, we have a real explosion in the way that we can characterize the different types of interventions we want to compare against each other. And the central question about how networks are formed is what gives us the opportunity to use those network nodes, which characterize different types of interventions, to test explanatory hypotheses. Now, some of the explanatory opportunities that this node-making approach in network meta-analysis offers is to go beyond the very standard types of approaches that we've described before in the literature, which really focus on labeling individual intervention components or focusing on clinically meaningful units, which is what we originally described as the types of intervention modalities that we might compare, to answering different kinds of questions that might be relevant to local policy contexts. One of the opportunities, again, that network meta-analysis and the node-making processes that NMA implies in terms of characterizing different types of interventions is to be able to characterize those nodes in the networks in ways that generate explanatory hypotheses that account for policy-relevant decisions. So a very concrete example of this draws on our work, which is forthcoming in American Journal of Public Health. And as part of this, we undertook a large-scale NIHR-funded systematic review of school-based interventions for the prevention of dating violence and gender-based violence. The resultant meta-analyses included 68 trials across the range of contexts where school-based interventions were implemented. Now, one of the really interesting aspects is that despite the fact that these interventions have been exhaustively systematically reviewed, almost all those meta-analyses predominantly drew on pairwise meta-analyses, comparing the totality of school-based interventions against a waitlist and no treatment, a business as usual control. When we undertook this review in the very specific context of a national policy crisis relating to dating violence and gender-based violence in the UK context. The Department for Education had at that moment instituted statutory guidance to all schools that made teaching around healthy relationships, i.e. the prevention of dating violence and gender-based violence, mandatory, but was refusing to fund that mandate. What this meant is that we had to step into a very specific policy gap relating to helping schools to characterize the type of intervention in terms of how extensive and how efficient those interventions were, in order to answer questions relating what schools needed to do to ensure that whatever provision was done around healthy relationships was effective. So the pairwise meta-analyses that underpin this, and I'm just going to focus on dating relationship violence. The pairwise meta-analyses that underpin this drew on random effects and robust variance estimation. And the short-term follow-up didn't really show convincing evidence of effectiveness, but the long-term follow-ups did for both prevention of victimization and prevention of perpetration. Notably, the amount of heterogeneity in each of those meta-analyses was relatively substantial. So we answered one of the questions that policymakers really needed, which is, how long do we need to wait until we show effect? Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, there is a need for long-term investment because effects tend to manifest most clearly after 1 year of implementation. But the remaining questions that arose related to how extensive and how to maximize the efficiency of these interventions. In order to generate the explanatory hypotheses that we wanted to test using this deductive method, we consulted policy and practice colleagues and young people. And the outcome of this consultation was an intervention categorization that was developed by delivery type, by breadth of mechanism, and by scope of implementation. Single component interventions we characterize as one-hit wonders. They were generally externally facilitated with someone parachuting in, teaching a few days or a week of content, and then leaving again. We also characterize interventions as curricular, as multi-component, or as multi-level, including several moving parts over several levels, including impacts and structural mechanisms, such as school contexts that were promoting or dissuading in respect of dating violence and gender-based violence. Importantly, because this was a deductive test, we undertook this categorization without knowledge of outcomes. So categorization was developed and undertaken in a way that was distinct and without knowledge of trial outcomes in order to make sure that the resultant test was as deductive as possible with respect to explanatory hypotheses. So one of the key benefits of network meta-analyses as well is that we can include head-to-head evidence. And what this meant is that we were able to additionally include several trials that we weren't able to include in pairwise meta-analyses. And those were trials that contributed evidence comparing multi-component and multi-level interventions and multi-level and curriculum interventions as well. We implemented network meta-analysis in STATA using a frequentist paradigm, and I'm just going to present the results of DRV victimization in the long term for simplicity. The way to read this particular table is that each of the different cells represents the comparative effectiveness of the column-forming treatment against the row-forming treatment. What this means is that single component interventions in the long term were effective for dating relationship violence victimization and reduced the odds of long-term DRE victimization by 40%. Notably, curriculum interventions and multi-component interventions did not show evidence of significance. Multi-level interventions were marginally significant. That's really like 0.999. But what this really clearly showed to us was that there was not compelling evidence that aggressively extensive interventions that often tax very scarce resources at the school level were necessarily more effective than single component interventions. We then bootstrapped the resultant estimates to generate rankings. And these rankings, importantly, did not suggest that multi-level interventions are a best bet. A lot of the prevailing curriculum and pedagogical theory around school-level interventions suggests that multi-level strategies are on balance going to generate more and more durable effects. What we found in this particular context was that based on the evidence, that wasn't an explanatory account that was necessarily valid across the distribution of trials that were included in this network meta-analysis. So from a deductive point of view, psychosocial network meta-analyses give us the opportunities to test more and different kinds of hypotheses. When this paper was making its way through peer review, one of the reviewer comments we got was why we didn't test a more modality-based approach to classifying interventions. For example, classifying social norms approaches against cognitive behavioral approaches, against motivational interviewing-based approaches. Our response to that was that we were taking under test of a directed hypothesis that was generated by policy stakeholders that was necessary in order to guide future guidance about how to implement efficient and effective interventions in schools. One of the reasons why I think this particular account is important is that we ultimately generated a null explanatory account of heterogeneity. Individual intervention types were not consistently more effective than any other. But what's important about this is that it tells us something really critical that can shape future delivery of these interventions, namely that complexity or complicatedness of interventions do not provide a particularly satisfactory account of heterogeneity. We regarded in the policy context that we were implementing it, this was a confirmatory account of heterogeneity because it was also supported by several parallel syntheses. And the confirmatory account of this finding is that it may be more important to do something well than to do something complicated. I now want to turn attention to abductive methods. Now, when I talk about abductive methods, what I mean is this blend of inference to the best explanation. The part of me that is a grounded theorist as a qualitative researcher understands abductive reasoning to be that shift in cyclical patterns between deductive hypothesis testing and inductive hypothesis generation. So abductive methods blend inference to the best explanation, partially deductive approaches, and partially inductive approaches. And I'm going to give you two examples of that. The first one is many studies, many variables, in which we blended latent class analysis with network meta-analysis. And the second is few studies, many variables, in which we used qualitative comparative analysis. One method that really drew on many studies, many variables, was an analysis that we undertook that blended latent class modeling with network meta-analysis. My colleagues Patty Lighton, Francis Gardner, and I undertook a large-scale systematic review of social learning theory-led parenting programs for disruptive child behaviors. This particular review culminated in 197 trials with 430 trial arms included. One of the points I really want to make now is that many of these programs are branded in ways that make a lot out of really not much difference between interventions. So one of the really questions that motivated this work is how do we account for these high levels of left-hand side and right-hand side heterogeneity, namely substantial variation in outcomes, but also substantial variation in the types of interventions in ways that cut across what might be explicitly avowed by program brands. In order to get at this question, we labeled all 430 trial arms according to the absence or presence of 19 different intervention components. Now, one strategy would have been to undertake different meta-regressions for each component one by one, but that would have been too many meta-regressions. And again, it wouldn't really have let us get or take advantage of the full extent of that right-hand side heterogeneity to develop that explanatory account. An important question that we wanted to test was if the ways components stuck together could tell us something about effectiveness that went beyond brands. So how did we do that? We undertook a series of latent class models. This is the inductive part of the analysis, looking at the 430 trial arms with 19, oh, goodness, the light just went off. I'm just going to keep going. So we undertook a latent class model looking at the 19 different components over the 430 trial arms, and we tested a series of sequential latent class models. The reason this is inductive is because the art of choosing an optimal latent class solution requires as much interpretation as it does statistical criteria, number one. And number two, ultimately, when faced with a choice between several different plausible solutions, we chose the one that made the most sense theoretically. What was clear to us was that based on the account of BIC, Bayesian information criterion, adjusted Bayesian information criterion, Kaike information criterion, and entropy, that we had a choice to make really between 4 and 5 classes. We ultimately decided that 5 classes provided the most satisfactory account of the right-hand side heterogeneity in this meta-analysis, and we confirmed that with a bootstrap likelihood ratio test that showed that 6 classes did not generate an improvement in fit over 5 classes, but 5 classes generated better fit than 4 classes. Looking at those 5 classes, we described them based on the kinds of components that were included. And the names that we gave to those 5 classes were interventions focused on behavior management alone, interventions focused on behavior management with parental self-management, interventions focused on behavior management with psychoeducation and relationship enhancement, interventions that we couldn't decide if we were going to call them monster truck or Cadillac because it was just all the components tipped into one intervention, or control interventions, i.e. interventions where no component was really of high probability. So this generated a statistical quandary for us, which is that latent class analyses measure class assignment with error. What I mean by this is that each of the trial arms included in our analysis had its own probability distribution function characterizing the probability that each of those trial arms belonged to each of the 5 different classes. So not only did we have left-hand side heterogeneity and right-hand side heterogeneity, we also had left-hand side error because, of course, effect sizes and meta-analyses are measured with error, and right-hand side error because of the distribution functions allocated to each of the trial arms. So how do we account for both right-hand side and left-hand side error? We used a method called pseudo-class imputations, where I took 20 multiply imputed draws of the class distributions. I estimated network meta-analyses on each of those 20 multiply imputed draws of the class distributions. I also estimated a chi-square likelihood ratio test within each of those multiply imputed draws for inconsistency. And then we combined the results using Rubin's rules to generate an overall estimate of the impact of the different intervention classes on effectiveness. The resultant league table is as follows. One of the findings that I really want you to take away from this is that, again, the slimmest programs appeared to be the most effective. Now, importantly, that idea of programs that are slimmest is one that really took advantage of the right-hand side heterogeneity in this meta-analysis to characterize a class of interventions that was, by definition, very slim and just focusing on those core behavior management components. Now, the estimates in this table are standardized mean differences on child conduct disorder problems at the first follow-up. What I want you to take away from this is that while all intervention strategies were effective, behavior management was not only the most effective strategy overall, it was also more effective than monster truck and behavior management, psychoeducation, and relationship management as well. So the key takeaway from this particular example is that we can test even more and different kinds of hypotheses in psychosocial network meta-analyses. The explanatory account of heterogeneity that we generated suggests both what kinds of interventions should be tested next, which is to say interventions that perhaps cut across the different latent classes that were statistically improbable in our latent class model, but also what kinds of interventions may be most reliably effective. The other thing I would like to point out is that even though this was a fairly taxing meta-analysis in terms of the richness of the data structure that was required, the use of latent variable method can help capture the spirit of interventions in ways that manual classification may not pick up. Something I'd be really interested to hear your view on is whether you would regard this account of heterogeneity, which again was fundamentally partly inductive, partly deductive, and thus a little bit abductive, is whether that account is confirmatory or exploratory. I now want to turn the corner to few studies, many variables, and that's qualitative comparative analysis. One of the really key values of QCA is that it gives us a way to integrate kinds of left-hand side heterogeneity that are traditionally really difficult to account for in meta-analysis. And what I mean by that specifically are variations in outcomes that point to the same construct, but that cannot meaningfully be meta-analyzed in the same model. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a bit. First, a bit of background. When I talk about qualitative comparative analysis, what I mean is a different approach to causation. QCA is premised on an approach to causation that is configurational, not successionist. And what I mean by that is an account of causation that focuses on how different causes come together to form pathways to an outcome, as opposed to a particular cause being a probability raiser or a probability dropper for the outcome. Probability raiser and probability dropper is actually the technical term from philosophy of science, which I think is fascinating, that all of these brainiacs couldn't come up with a more artful term than probability raiser or probability dropper, but that's how we refer to them in successionist causation. Importantly, QCA also focuses on combinations of causes as opposed to single causes, and seeks to understand causation as sufficient, and in some cases necessary, not net effects. So the logic here is one of how do we form a pathway to an outcome, not what is the effect of a variable on an outcome controlling for other variables. Now, importantly, QCA can be used alongside standard meta-analysis, and that was the way that we used it here. So this particular example relates to parenting programs to prevent child physical abuse recurrence. The parent review was published in 2017 in Clinical Child and Family Psychology Review, and it included 14 trials that tested parenting programs that prevented the recurrence of child physical abuse. Now, of the 14 included trials, 7 presented child abuse recurrence outcomes, but only 4 were meta-analyzable, and you can see them on the right here. Another 3 trials used survival analysis in a way that was not amenable to meta-analysis with single cross-sectional time point follow-ups. And the remaining trials reported a potpourri of outcomes that were very proximal to child abuse, but that were not directly estimates of child abuse. Now, the rather meager and paltry meta-analysis in the original paper only included 4 trials and suggested that there was an 11 percentage point risk difference reduction in the risk of child physical abuse recurrence at follow-up. However, that account wasn't particularly satisfactory because we were only looking at a very narrow slice of the analysis of the possible trials that could contribute to generate that explanatory account. So we decided to remix the analysis and do this using a qualitative comparative analysis. So what did this remix look like? Of the 14 trials, we subsetted those 10 trials that compared interventions versus minimal controls. So we parked the 4 trials that compared active versus active interventions because those were not super informative in this particular context. So of the 10 trials comparing interventions versus minimal controls, we ultimately extracted 14 comparisons, which is to say there were 14 different active trial arms that were each compared against a control across the 10 included trials. One of the critical steps in qualitative comparative analysis is calibrating interventions. And in this particular application, which is known as crisp set QCA, as opposed to its fuzzier sibling, fuzzy set QCA, we crisp setted the interventions as being most effective or least effective. And we did that by considering effect sizes using a prioritization. First, we looked at official records of re-abuse. Then we looked at self-reported measures of child abuse. And third, we relied on observational measures of harsh and hostile parenting as the outcome that was proximal to child abuse and that could tell us something about the likely impact on child abuse, but that was our least preferred as a measure of re-abuse or abuse recurrence. So having undertaken that, we then labeled interventions as to the presence or absence of components from a theoretically led list. Now, this is where the abductive part comes in, because what this ultimately began was a cycle of reasoning that began with our components that were theoretically led, and then looking at those, looking at how those provide an account and separate between most and least effective interventions. As part of this analysis, we began with a long list, we compressed that list even further, and then we ultimately included nonviolent punishment strategies, proactive parenting strategies, and attachment-focused strategies as key factors informing the qualitative comparative analysis. Part of the abductive aspect of this analysis was that we began with psychoeducation and empathy-focused components as components that we expected would be central to the analysis, but that ultimately were kind of useless. And instead, we introduced a new category into the analysis that emerged as being a plausible but unexpected explanation for that contributed to those causal pathways distinguishing most and least effective interventions. And that category related to parental self-management, which emerged as important to distinguish between most and least effective interventions. In this particular case, we understood parental self-management to be components and interventions that were directed at helping parents to manage their own stress, alongside the other components which were directed to teaching parents new kinds of ways to parent their children that tilted away and reduced the risk for child physical abuse recurrence. So qualitative comparative analysis culminates in what we might call the analysis moment or the analytic moment, and that relies on a procedure called as Boolean minimization. I'm very proud of myself that when I drafted the paper for this particular analysis, I got the journal to accept the terminology crunch the numbers as a satisfactory explanation for what Boolean minimization is. But in short, the process of Boolean minimization is what takes the different kinds of components, combinations that we have on the right-hand side, and the most and least effective distinction we have on the left-hand side, and then looks at the common pathways between them. What did we take away from the particular minimized solutions? The particular minimized solutions suggested that most effective interventions combined alternative punishment with either no self-management and no proactive parenting, or with self-management and proactive parenting. Alternately, effective interventions included no attachment-facing components, but did include alternative punishment components. Now, reading across and between this jargony set of minimized solutions, the explanation that emerged from this was that interventions to be effective in this context and for this outcome needed to either do one thing and do it well, or do a lot of things, but alongside teach parents to manage their stress, possibly to manage the incredible cognitive load that comes with essentially needing to relearn how to parent, which was the idea that underpinned a lot of these interventions. Ultimately, least effective interventions focused on doing too much or not doing enough. And where interventions did too much, that was notable because they lacked self-management components alongside teaching a panoply and diversity of child-focused parenting skills. So the key takeaways from this particular method are that causal pathways, or the causal pathways that we generated in the QCA, were theory generating as opposed to meta-analyses as being theory testing. Again, QCA helps us to account for both left-hand side and right-hand side heterogeneity in ways that are traditionally very difficult for meta-analytic methods to deal with, which is to say accounting for diverse outcomes that point closely to the same construct. I would submit that QCA is primarily exploratory versus confirmatory. The goal of this was to contribute to developing understanding as opposed to finalizing a model. Importantly, in this case, our abductive reasoning started with theory-led models and an iterated explanation from there. But previous work I've undertaken with Katie Sutcliffe also describes using other starting points to identify the conditions that can be used in a QCA, for example, user views and stakeholder engagement. I now finally want to turn all the way around the corner to talk about inductive methods, primarily focusing on realist synthesis. Now, realist synthesis leans all the way into heterogeneity. Diverse contexts, diverse study types, and diverse outcomes are all key to generating an informative realist synthesis. And when I talk about an informative realist synthesis, I mean a realist synthesis that provides a high fidelity, analytically generalizable, explanatory account of how interventions work, where they work, and towards which outcomes. A cornerstone of realist analysis is the context mechanism outcome configuration, and the combination of these configurations together are what we would characterize as a developing program theory. Now, these context mechanism outcome configurations, or CMOs for short, are generated in ways that are analytically very similar to grounded theory. Please don't quote me on that. Realist evaluators and realist synthesizers have a very militant regard for their method, and bracketing the cult of personality that exists around realist methods, I would politely submit, in a way that I hope doesn't, get me emailed death threats, that the process of generating a realist analysis, which focuses on explanation, social process, contextual contingency, and outcome, is fundamentally very similar to the analytic processes that we use to develop grounded theory. So looping back around to the STOP DRV GBV analysis, which again was school-based interventions to prevention of dating relationship violence and gender-based violence, We concluded this review with a realist synthesis, and this realist synthesis drew on 249 papers that we included over a range of parallel syntheses, okay? These parallel syntheses were of intervention theories, of intervention components, of the challenges of implementing interventions, of effectiveness, the results of which you've already seen, of mediation studies, and of equity impacts, which are important to characterize the ways in which DRV and GBV interventions may or may not equally serve the needs of all students across schools where they're being delivered. We used a combination of meta-regression, network meta-analysis, and QCA as theory consolidation steps to test and integrate the findings from all of these parallel syntheses and to develop an explanatory account of how it is that school-based interventions for the prevention of dating and relationship violence and gender-based violence achieve or do not achieve their effects. So we use these findings from these parallel syntheses in an iterative, constant comparative fashion to generate a new explanatory framework for included interventions. And we use this as well to explain patterns of effectiveness that were better and more consistent for dating violence and gender-based violence. One of the central questions that arose in undertaking the meta-analyses was that the pattern of effectiveness was consistently much better and much clearer for DRV than for GBV. But we also needed a way to account for that unexpected finding from the network meta-analysis that the complexity of interventions didn't necessarily tell us more about how effective those interventions would be. We undertook this analysis over several cycles of investigator meetings and generated the following explanation. Our final explanatory framework focused on several contextual factors at the school level, namely school contexts that are high capacity and high resource, and student level factors, including the number of male participants, the critical mass of female participants in schools, and previous participant involvement in dating and relationship violence perpetration as being important contextual factors that shaped response to intervention over school and student levels. Our mechanism-based explanation focused on a social transformation mechanism, which emerged as particularly salient to distinguish interventions that were effective for gender-based violence, and a basic safety mechanism, by which we mean a mechanism by which students are encouraged and essentially induced to stop engaging in DRV behaviors that emerged as being particularly focal to the success of individually facing dating and relationship violence interventions. The basis of this explanatory framework was to describe the ways that individual level mechanisms were especially salient for driving reductions in dating violence, whereas school-level mechanisms were especially salient for driving reductions in gender-based violence, and the moderation and the equity impacts of those different mechanisms across different types of schools, different groups of students, and different compositional characteristics of students, culminating in outcomes in reductions of GBV victimization and DRV victimization by the prevention of perpetration as well. So, summing all of this up, learning to love heterogeneity in all of its forms requires knowing what to do with it. And matching explanatory methods to heterogeneity requires thinking through what kinds of heterogeneity exist in your body of studies, left-hand side or right-hand side or both. Whether explanatory accounts are confirmatory or exploratory remains an open question. And the best intuition I can come up with, and again, I'm really keen to hear your views, are that whether those accounts are confirmatory or exploratory is possibly determined by the scope of their application. Certainly from a strictly inductive perspective, such as in realist synthesis, program theories that emerge from realist syntheses are always viewed as being tentative or in development. Whereas network meta-analyses, the findings from those, when those are sufficiently powered and broad enough, can be viewed as essentially confirmatory for shaping future policy practice and treatment. So with that, I'll pause with my sincerest thanks, and I will look forward to hearing whatever questions you have.
Great, thank you so much, GJ. And we've got plenty of time for questions. You're welcome to drop a question in the chat or raise your hand if you want to say anything out loud. And I guess I'll take the chair's. Oh, we've got one question from Sean. No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. It's like that commercial. Thanks as always for sharing your brilliance with us, GJ. That was fantastic. And I think my question, I'd love to hear from your experience. I know in our training, sometimes anything other than the box standard Cochrane type review method gets criticism as deviating from best practice. I know you've got a wealth of experience now, not just of doing these methods rigorously, but working with users of research evidence who wanted these kinds of syntheses. So could you speak to your experience of how useful, compared to traditional reviews, users of evidence who were supposed to be doing all of this work for have found these kinds of syntheses? Have they appreciated you figuring out rigorous ways to do all of these things to answer different kinds of questions through research synthesis?
So I'd be lying if I said that all of these examples had some kind of incredible, amazing policy impact. The latent class analysis with NMA paper was something that I came up with in an 8-hour writing session with my co-author, Patty Lighton. And I did all the programming for on a 12-hour flight to South Korea. So that was more like, this is cool, let's do this, right? One of the things that we have found is that policy, I think, as with all of these issues, the key is matching the question and the method to what policymakers need, right? So I think there's often a regression to the assumption that what policymakers want is the answer, whereas I think something that we've certainly learned over the last few years is that often there is a desire for some complexity or something to think about, or really a starting point for thinking as opposed to the capital A answer. Something like QCA we have found to be very useful as well in terms of supporting policymakers to think about what are the kinds of pathways to effectiveness that we want to bring to bear in our local context, okay? And I think similarly for the network meta-analysis, one of the key issues that I don't think we fully avowed in a way that is explicit is the ability to use those different nodes in the network to test policy relevant hypotheses. A lot of the literature around component network meta-analysis in psychosocial approaches, which a lot of it has been undertaken by my colleague, Debbie Caldwell, I think very appropriately for the scope of that application, focuses on components that we understand to be fixed and to exist based on the canon of clinical psychology knowledge. In this particular case, we had a real opportunity to use an alternative approach to forming those nodes in the network that was developed in order to address a question that was very immediately relevant to policy and practice. Sean, still can't hear you.
God, I keep muting when I have tea. I really appreciate that. I appreciated your thought earlier about how much heterogeneity is explained by what we traditionally look at in these nodes. And if it's not much, in addition to using this method to answer questions about nodes that are more of interest to policymakers, it does make me wonder, like, are we focusing on things that really don't explain that much heterogeneity in all of this work? And your call to think about heterogeneity as a parameter of interest rather than nuisance.
It's not a parameter of interest, Sean, it's a gift. So, okay, we need to acknowledge heterogeneity.
Apologies.
That it is.
Right, next question from Michael in the chat. With NMA, what values are used to determine the ties and the node sizes?
Thanks. So that is just a standard package, a standard feature of the package that we used, which accentuates which nodes have the most trial arms attached to them. So the weighting is strictly based on the number of trials. It's not based on like how big the effect is or how confident we are in the effect. It's just a function of the package that tells you how much evidence there is with respect to that specific node.
I sort of had a related question about that. Can you say anything about how, so actually, let's say, right, I think it's really interesting to think about translating this network meta-analysis methodology that's been used largely in clinical medical contexts into these new realms, right? Social science trials. When you do that, though, how do you contend with like the assumptions of network meta-analysis that are sometimes judged to be plausible in the clinical context, but seem like they could be very challenging in trials like the ones that you described, right? So consistency, transitivity, et cetera.
So I think the inconsistency aspect reduces to a statistical test, right? And that's like not a great answer, but in short, like you can do those same kinds of tests, right? I don't think there's any real difference in terms of the feasibility assessments that you have to do to really get underneath whether your NMA is actually meaningful, okay? So one of the reasons why that's important as well is that it means that we can then focus on the distribution of effect modifiers across the network, okay, which is the case no matter what kind of NMA you're doing, but also making sure that you have proposed to test in a deductive fashion the kinds of effect modifiers that you expect will be relevant and that we need to test in order to make sure that our network findings are robust to that kind of effect modification. So for the NMAs that I presented, we actually did check whether interventions were undertaken in high-income contexts or low-income contexts as an effect modifier. And we also checked percentage of girls as an effect modifier, because both of those things were things that emerged in pre-specified meta-regressions as being potentially of relevance in understanding heterogeneity. And in both cases, findings were robust to those meta-regressions.
David, you had a question?
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you for the great talk. It stimulated a lot of interesting ideas about which I will ask you about one, which is in the violence prevention studies. I didn't catch what the population was in most of the studies, whether it was like a general population of the high school students or something, or whether it was focused on, some of them may have been focused on offenders and trying to prevent prevention, doing it again. If there's a mixture of those kinds of things, I think it's possible that there are, vaguely speaking, two kinds of groups: people who would never do it in the first place, and people who would. And therefore, you could, for the people who wouldn't do it, you would never see a reduction, and for the people who would, you might. And therefore, some sort of mixture model might be good for those studies if they differed in the populations. That's the only way it could be identified, I think, is if there were differences in the populations in proportions of those kinds of people.
So I'm afraid my answer to your question is going to be really boring and twofold. I think the first is that we address that problem in the design of the meta-analysis by only focusing on universal school-based interventions, okay? The other way that is that even if we had wanted to, we couldn't test for that using a meta-regression based approach because that evidence was so poorly reported across included trials, okay? But like I said, we accounted for that at the design phase by making sure that populations were similar in terms of the universality of the interventions that were deployed. I would love nothing more than to fit a mixture model on the right-hand side and a mixture model on the left-hand side and make M+ burn my computer to the ground in the process. I've not had the chance to do that yet on a meta-analysis, but I'm going to send you an email and maybe we'll do it. Okay.
Great, thanks.
We have a question from Jenna on the chat. Have you seen these methods used well in other topic areas within public health research?
So a lot of the use of NMA in psychosocial context has been with respect to psychological interventions. And again, my colleague Debbie Caldwell, I think, is the one who's really been doing the most in terms of driving forward the thinking around that. The other thing I would say is that from a QCA point of view, actually, Jenna, we began this line of work with my colleague Katie Sutcliffe by reanalyzing existing reviews that hadn't given sufficiently adequate explanatory accounts, okay? And the one that we did that on was actually the Tier 2 Weight Management Program guideline that was generated by NICE. So the developers of that guideline meta-regressed the living daylights out of those studies and couldn't find a satisfactory account. So it was only when we reanalyzed those studies using QCA and using perspectives of service users as the basis to generate those causal conditions that we were able to generate a satisfactory, albeit exploratory, account of why the heterogeneity existed in that body of evidence.
Thank you. Question from Andrew. I always worry that there is no agreement on what an intervention component is. For example, education or educational components or educational components. Should we go down to the granularity of mechanisms instead?
I think that's an open question. I think a lot of it depends on how you understand components to exist. And I think what I would probably observe is that realists do not have a monopoly on the idea of mechanism in the context of evidence synthesis. So we have previously flexibly used mechanism to refer to change processes or theoretically activated domains of change, as opposed to how realists might understand mechanisms, which are theoretically portable causal concepts that account for the explanation of the association between one variable and another. One of the reasons why this is important, Andrew, is because, again, when you step beyond psychotherapeutic interventions, which tend to be highly manualized and very well characterized, you run into trouble in terms of that consistency of labeling. So in that respect, you're absolutely right. In that particular way, you could understand the way that we approach the NMA as being a bit of a cop-out, in the sense that we didn't assign interventions to classes based on context. But I would submit that it was actually the most reliable way to give schools the answers that they needed, which is by defining nodes based on what you might essentially describe as the estimand of interest, which is the link between complexity and complicatedness of intervention and ease of implementation and effectiveness. So I think that there is a need to go beyond just focusing on components as a basis for labeling interventions in network meta-analysis. But I think one of the takeaways from this presentation is certainly that the basis for doing that depends very strongly on what the policy question is that you're trying to meet.
You know, one of the things I wondered about when you were talking about the comparative qualitative analysis, and I think also the realist synthesis approach, was that it seemed like those approaches require making judgments about the quantitative findings from the primary evidence base. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So could you say more about how you approach that? You know, sort of approach the qualitative interpretation of something like an effect size and confidence interval?
Okay, so I think what I would say there is that when we get to the point of doing that, you're fundamentally using qualitative criteria to judge the reliability of that analysis. Okay, so what that means is that ultimately, I think the best you can do is to just be very explicit about how you did that, make sure that analysis is auditable, make sure it's credible, and make sure it's trustworthy in terms of going through the details about how that calibration happened and why it happened. So in the example that we had, you know, we were very clear in a sense that we presented the focal effect size that we used to make that determination. And then we presented whether or not we judged as being most or least effective on the basis of that focal effect size. One of the things that we have found is that if you use visual tools like forest plots, for example, to look at the spread of outcomes, it becomes pretty clear looking at your studies where that cleft happens between most and least effective. For the dating violence analyses, we looked at the subset of trials that only presented outcomes relating to dating violence victimization, for example, because we had enough there to get on with in terms of doing that distinction. When we did that, and when we looked at the spread of outcomes in there, what we found was that an odds ratio of 0.9 was a really valuable distinguishing point between most and least effective. Because the ones that generated odds ratios greater than 0.9, closer to 1, tended not to really generate significant effects anyway. And the ones with odds ratios lower than 0.9 did in fact tend to be effective. I'm sad we bored your daughter. Did in fact tend to be effective to a significant degree. So again, this is one of the configurational aspects of that analysis, which is figuring out where do you put those cut points and how do you move on from there. Right. But as with any qualitative analysis, ultimately its quality rests on the credibility and trustworthiness and the ability of the analyst to lay bare those assumptions in a way that permits understanding how you got to the answer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. One thing I wondered about there is like whether the quantitative techniques from meta-analysis could be useful for refining the information that's then used in the qualitative analysis. Like for example, right? Sorry, and school's off today. So, for example, right? Could you re-estimate the effect sizes from individual trials using meta-analysis, right? Shrink them and look at the empirical Bayes estimates of effects from individual trials. Would that give you any sort of better purchase on making the qualitative judgments about them?
I mean, it might. I think what I would say is that the use of the empirical Bayes estimator probably isn't, I would probably say it's ancillary to the core of the method, which is really based on case-based knowledge. So what underpins QCA is less kind of the fact of an effect as such, but more the fact of the knowledge of the individual case in terms of shaping how you understand them. This is one of the reasons why we describe QCA as being small n many variables, because a number of variables you could potentially include is huge, but really once you get past an n that doesn't let you to really get underneath effectiveness or not effectiveness, the analysis really starts to lose its meaning. So it's almost more important, I think, to really get underneath what's going on in an individual trial than perhaps to think about how we would do that estimation. Although, you know, because QCA, because of the methods of using QCA, we don't really understand sensitivity analysis in the same way that we would for example, a meta-regression, where we might subset studies by risk of bias.
There's a follow-up question by Sean in the chat. Do you factor study quality or ROV in your QCA approach? An example concerned high risk of bias is highly correlated with studies you've judged that worked.
So that is, I think, probably the next point of our research. What I would say is that in CRISP-seq, so I think what you're getting at, or one possible avenue that could be pursued as a result of this question, is to understand how we might weight studies based on risk of bias. That kind of weighting doesn't really make a ton of sense in a CRISP set framework, because the goal for a CRISP set framework is complete consistency. And what I mean by that is that all of the causal combinations are either completely effective or completely least effective. In a fuzzy set framework, which I didn't talk to today, you could hypothetically weight studies. And in fact, there is some evidence around doing that to account, for example, for population size when this is done using national level estimates, which QC is often used in that context as well. You could think about developing ways to weight studies, to upweight or downweight them based on risk of bias in a fuzzy set model in order to account for how strongly those different observations might influence consistency and coverage.
Okay, I think we've tapped out questions. So let me just, I think I speak for everyone in saying this is really, really engaging. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.
For anyone who's still on, our next seminar will be coming up in, I think, exactly 1 month on February 17th. Jamal Young from Texas A&M University will be speaking on meta-analytic quant-crit, exploring the possibilities. And yeah, we did record today, and that recording will be up on the website within a couple of days. Thanks very much all for coming, and enjoy your weekend.